Hi, my name is Sagar Takkar. I'm a counseling psychologist, and in this video, I want to talk about whether therapy works or not, or does it even work. So, there is no guarantee in anything. That's what I was thinking about. That, if even if let's say if we consider, for example, NASA sending a rocket to space, let's say they are they have invested billions, millions or billions of dollars into the project, and you um, some of the most brilliant minds on the planet are working on that project. That still doesn't guarantee that the project will be successful. So when we think of effectiveness of anything, what we think about is, or the realistic expectation is that it increases the chances of you achieving the desired results. So in that sense, yes, therapy is effective. Therapy has worked for a lot of people. But let's also think about therapy hasn't worked for a lot of people, right? And why is that? So often I think of a few factors why it might not have worked for someone. Um, One thing that I like, one of the most major things that I think about is that, which is why I'm creating this video, is that people, probably a lot of people, do not have faith in therapy, especially if they haven't tried it before. They want to test it, and that's right, that's valid, right? If you do not know if whether something would works or not, then you would want to test it. But the general perception around therapy in the culture often is that therapy doesn't work, or does it really work? There's a question mark, there's a doubt around it. And I believe why it exists is because therapy is not a magic pill. So when we think about the framing of the question, does therapy work? It points towards a deeper problem. We're asking whether therapy works as if therapy is this magical thing. If you just engage in the process, then something would uh, change, something would shift inside you. Whereas how therapy works, or if when is therapy effective? Therapy is effective if there are certain right conditions, and the right conditions involve the client side as well. If therapy has to work for me as a client, I have to be actively involved in the process. And there's a huge part of the effort on my end that would make therapy work. So it's not like therapy works, it's more like if I am doing the work in therapy, then chances that therapy will work will increase. So there are a few factors that I'm thinking about that make therapy work. One of the most important ones would be what's technically called therapist client match, or a therapist client fit, which is essentially that the relationship between the therapist and the client, how you feel with your therapist, how comfortable, how safe, how if there's this fit, then you just feel, you can feel it. It's something that there's a sense of ease, safety, comfort that comes when there's a therapist client fit. It's like you just you can feel it in your body. It's like a feeling of connection that you feel with your therapist. And why this is so important is because the therapeutic interventions, the specific therapeutic approaches, as per research, also have been understood that it's not the approaches, it's not the technical approach that the therapist uses that does the healing, or that does dictate the outcomes of the process. Of course, that it plays a part, but the major part is played by the relationship that's shared between the therapist and the client. It's the relationship that heals. So much of healing that happens in therapy happens because of the relationship, and that's why it's one of the first factors that I would like to talk about. That um, if whether there's a therapist client match or not, a fit or not, and that's more. something that you can feel, how much ease, how much safety, how much comfort you feel with your therapist. The other factor I would like to talk about is your active involvement in the process as a client, that you're willing to go to uncomfortable places, that you're not completely sort of putting the responsibility on the therapist or the therapeutic process for healing, that you're thinking, oh, just by engaging in this process, just by showing up for a session, change would happen. That's not how, like, it's the realist that's not realistic. That's not how it works. Of course, there it is definitely possible just by showing up that you might see certain changes. Yes, certain changes will come just by showing up, uh, but it will stagnate after a point. And for therapy to the whole process to be very effective, your active involvement, a lot of effort, in fact, a lot of effort from your end would be required, which would look like being willing to talk about certain things which are very painful, maybe face those painful emotions. Of course, it's very much the therapist's responsibility to do it in a safe manner so that you're not quote unquote re-traumatized, which means that you get so overwhelmed that you become, let's say, it becomes difficult for you to function. But at the same time, that's necessary that the client has willingness to go to some uncomfortable places. Um, so I think these are two most important factors, and rest of the factors are more like um, play a much less significant role, uh, or they can be sort of subcategorized under the therapist client match. So the therapist client match can exist only if it is an ethical therapist, if it is a good therapist, if the therapist is skilled, competent. So the therapist factors I would include in the under the therapist client match. So the entire point being that people not having faith in therapy makes sense because it requires a lot of effort. It is a slow process. It takes a lot of time and it doesn't always work. But why it doesn't always work is often because maybe there's the client therapist mismatch, but maybe also because the client loses hope at certain points. Client sort of becomes um, when they do not see enough progress happening after, let's say, a few months, then they sort of lose hope in the process. And I think if only the client could talk about it in the sessions and sort of bring that up to the therapist, then it can be very helpful. Of course, then what happens next would be very much dependent on how the therapist reacts to it. If the therapist is able to make space for it, understand what's happening, what's not working for the client, and if the therapist is able to make changes accordingly, or if the therapist reacts negatively to it, then I would say then it's the therapist's fault or something to do with the at the therapist's end. But it would be very much helpful that the client is able to bring that up if they're not seeing much progress in therapy. And by putting in that effort, again, the chances of therapy working eventually increases. So all in all, you can sort of make therapy work by engaging in it in a proactive manner, by telling the therapist if something doesn't seem to work, and by sticking with it for long enough duration. And you don't need to stick with the same therapist forever. Sometimes you reach a certain you make a lot of progress with a certain therapist, and then you reach a point where it gets more stuck. It starts stagnating, and that's all right. You can bring it up to the therapist, and it might bringing it up and having that discussion might sort of um, help you make further progress, or the therapist might mutually decide with you to maybe terminate the process with this particular therapist and maybe continue with another therapist. Sometimes, that's what's required. A change of therapist is sometimes required. So if you stick with the process long enough and put in effort uh, as a client, and you change therapists when required, then I think max to max in let's say in 3 4 years, I think I'm giving the upper limit. Like in 3 4 years, if you're doing things right, then you must see incredible progress in whatever concerns that brought you to therapy. I hope this helps. Have a nice day.